Hello and welcome. This is Andrew Evans. Today's topic is the International Space Station and its impact on bipolarity, globalization, and late capitalism. The International Space Station is one of the greatest non-military collaborations in the modern world, bringing former enemies and friends together to benefit mankind. To understand how the space station came to be, we must understand the history of space exploration and how bipolarity contributed to the exploration of space. After World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States were involved in a Cold War. This pitted capitalism versus communism, thus bipolarity. A race to space began between these two countries. This intensified the Cold War rivalry as each competed for dominance in space. Dominance in the space race was a matter of pride, but also involved being able to send rockets to attack the other country. The U.S. was shocked in October of 1957 as the USSR launched Sputnik, the first satellite in space. This hurt the U.S. pride, but also proved that the Soviet Union could send nuclear-typed missiles to hit the United States. The United States answered with its own satellite, Explorer 1, in January 1958. At this time, President Eisenhower tried to talk to Soviet Premier Khrushchev about securing space for peaceful exploration. This was rejected by Khrushchev as he felt that the Soviet Union was far ahead in space technology. The United States took its proposal for peaceful space to the United Nations. This led to the Outer Space Treaty and a UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Space. The Soviet Union reluctantly agreed to join the committee. In April of 1960, a summit meeting between Khrushchev and Eisenhower was supposed to talk about space. Unfortunately, the downing of the United States U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union canceled the summit. Early in his presidency, Kennedy tried to talk to the Soviet Union about space exploration. He even included in his inaugural address, "Together, let us explore the stars." Less than 3 months after Kennedy's speech, the Soviet Union landed its first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. Only after a United States astronaut, John Glenn, orbited the Earth did the Soviet Union consider cooperating with the United States in space, but only with weather and communication satellites. The space race became more intense when President Kennedy challenged the United States and NASA to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The race to the moon began. The United States was very open about its space flights, as each flight was a public event. The Soviets were very secretive because it was believed there were many accidents. The United States won the race to the moon with the Apollo 11 mission, followed by 5 more moon landings. After the moon flights, the challenge for each country was what to do next. The United States sent a space station, Skylab, into space, but this did not last very long. The main focus for the United States was a reusable spacecraft, the Space Shuttle. The Soviet Union decided to set up space stations and man the Salyut series of space stations. In the mid-70s, there was one moment of cooperation, the Apollo-Soyuz project. A United States Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz craft docked while in space. The crews greeted each other and shook hands. This was a dramatic display in the middle of the Cold War. Apollo-Soyuz, with an X over it, unfortunately, changes that the Soviet Union was stealing United States technology, stopped any further joint missions. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan stopped any further cooperation. The United States turned to other countries for help. The Europeans helped build the Space Lab model in the cargo hold of the space shuttle. Canada built the robotic arm the shuttle used to place satellites into orbit. After Reagan was elected president, the Cold War tensions were rising. The United States-Soviet Space Cooperation Agreement was up for renewal in 1982, but the United States allowed it to lapse. Mutual suspicion about the shuttle and Soviet Salyut space station cooled any cooperation for 10 years. In his 1984 State of the Union address, Reagan discussed a permanently manned space station he called Freedom. He invited other countries to participate, except for the Soviet Union. Very little cooperation happened in the 1980s, mainly because of the United States initiative of a Star Wars. This was a program to develop space weapons to shoot down enemy missiles. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the new Russian government planned on creating a new space station. The United States was also working on a station to fulfill President Reagan's promise. The costs for the stations were high. There was warming of Russian-United States relations, so in the early 1990s, the United States, Russia, and many other countries came together to plan an international space station. The initial components were integrated models of separate Russian to United States stations. Assembly began in 1998 with the Russian Zarya and American Unity modules. More parts were added. The first crew consisted of 2 Russians and 1 American. Occupation began on November 2, 2000. Further construction used components and help from the United States, Russia, Canada, Brazil, and 11 European countries. Spacewalks were required to assemble the parts. A Soyuz spacecraft remained permanently as a lifeboat. The International Space Station became fully operational in 2009 and began hosting 6-man crew. It has been continually occupied since the original 3 inhabitants. As of July 2018, there have been over 227 different people on the International Space Station from 18 different countries. This includes countries such as Malaysia, South Africa, Spain, and Brazil. The majority, 143, have came from the United States. Needless to say, the International Space Station is a great example of globalization. The crew of the International Space Station has done many experiments in biology, earth science, human research, and medicine. A major focus of research is how humans tolerate long time in space to prepare for trips to Mars and beyond. After the shuttle was returned in 2011, the International Space Station has been served by unmanned flights for supplies and Soyuz spacecrafts to replace crew members. The United States contract with Russia expires later this year for the rides on the Soyuz spacecraft. Private companies like SpaceX are working on United States manned space flights as early as later this year. It is unlikely that the International Space Station will continue. The United States may stop funding as early as 2025, with plans to turn control over to private companies as the United States begins focusing on deep space flights. Several companies have shown interest, but none have committed. The International Space Station has been one of the greatest non-military, multinational projects in the history of mankind. Its connection to bipolarity has its roots in the Cold War and space race, with the 2 superpowers competing for bragging rights, but also world influence. Globalization can be seen in the name International Space Station as the involvement of so many countries. Late capitalism can be seen in more recent activities, including private supply ships and potential future occupations of the International Space Station by private companies. The International Space Station is one of the most significant examples of non-military cooperation in the history of the world. It contributed in the reduction of bipolarity while advancing globalization. Late capitalism is increasing as private companies become more involved.